Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time, way back, to an era where a common cold could be a death sentence and a trip to the doctor was less about healing and more about hoping for a miracle, or at least not being made worse. Imagine for a moment, you're shuffling through the bustling, noisy streets of ancient Rome, the smell of garum and unwashed bodies hanging heavy in the air. You've got a nagging cough, maybe a persistent headache, and you decide, with a brave but perhaps foolish heart, to seek medical help. You step into a physician's clinic, a dimly lit room filled with the clatter of strange instruments and the pungent odor of herbs, or worse, something unidentifiable. You might look around at the crude tools, the questionable concoctions bubbling in clay pots, and realize, with a sinking feeling, that your best bet for survival might just be divine intervention, not the doctor's scalpel. Seriously, you probably wouldn't survive. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in a city of unparalleled grandeur, a sprawling metropolis that dominates the known world. The aqueducts deliver fresh water, the roads are meticulously paved, and the public baths are architectural marvels. Yet, despite this advanced civilization, if you happen to fall ill, you're about to discover a side of Roman life that's anything but glorious. Forget everything you know about modern medicine, about sterile environments, trained professionals, and effective treatments. In ancient Rome, being a patient often meant signing up for a truly miserable experience, one that frequently ended in pain, disfigurement, or worse. Imagine, for a moment, you've woken up with a fever, your head pounding, your body aching. Your Roman neighbor, kind-hearted but misinformed, suggests you visit a local medicus. This isn't a gleaming hospital with white-coated doctors. Oh no. Your medicus is likely a man who learned his trade through apprenticeship, perhaps from an equally untrained predecessor, or even a freed slave who gained some medical knowledge tending to his master's household. There's no formal medical school in the way we understand it. No rigorous curriculum, no standardized examinations, no licensing boards. The closest thing to a medical education might be reading the works of Hippocrates or Galen, often misinterpreted or applied without any real scientific understanding. You might encounter a physician who, despite lacking formal training, exudes an air of confidence, perhaps even arrogance. They'll likely have a small, cluttered office, filled with various jars of mysterious substances, dried herbs hanging from the rafters, and an assortment of crude tools that look more suited for carpentry than human anatomy. As you describe your symptoms, they might nod sagely, already formulating a diagnosis based on theories that would make a modern doctor wince. The prevailing belief, heavily influenced by Greek thought, revolves around the four humors blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. The idea is that your body is a delicate balance of these four fluids, and any illness is simply an imbalance. So, if you have a fever, the doctor might conclude you have an excess of blood, and the solution, bleeding you, of course. This isn't a gentle, controlled procedure. You might find yourself subjected to venesection, where a vein is cut, or even cupping, where heated cups are placed on your skin to draw blood to the surface. The sight of your own blood, intentionally spilled onto the floor, might be alarming, but the medicus assures you it's for your own good. The logic is simple. If flawed, too much of a humor means you need to get rid of it. If you're full of phlegm, they might induce vomiting or give you powerful laxatives. Imagine the discomfort, the nausea, the sheer indignity of being subjected to such aggressive and often debilitating treatments, all in the name of restoring balance. Beyond the humoral theory, Roman doctors often dabbled in what we would consider pure superstition. While some physicians tried to be empirical, observing and recording, many were still heavily influenced by omens, prayers, and the belief that illness was a divine punishment or the work of evil spirits. You might find your medicus prescribing an amulet to ward off evil, or suggesting a pilgrimage to a temple dedicated to Asclepius, the god of medicine, rather than offering a practical solution. The lines between medicine, magic, and religion were incredibly blurred, making a rational approach to illness a rare luxury. Consider the practicalities of being a patient. There were no pain relievers beyond mild herbal concoctions, and certainly no anesthetics for major procedures. If you needed a tooth pulled or a broken bone set, you simply endured the agonizing pain. You might be given some opium, if you were lucky, but its effects would be limited, and the experience would still be excruciating. Infections were rampant. Without any understanding of germ theory, surgical instruments were reused without sterilization, wounds were dressed with unsanitary materials, and basic hygiene was often neglected. A simple cut could quickly turn into a life-threatening infection, festering and spreading, with little the medicus could do to stop it. The remedies themselves were often bizarre, sometimes repulsive. You might be prescribed a potion made from mummified flesh, believed to contain the life force of the deceased, or perhaps a poultice of animal excrement, applied directly to your skin, the logic being that foul substances could draw out foul humors. One particularly unusual, though widely accepted, historical fact is the use of gladiators' blood. Yes, you heard that right. It was believed to be a cure for epilepsy, and desperate families would rush to the arena after a fight, hoping to collect fresh blood from a fallen gladiator. The thought of consuming such a remedy is enough to make anyone queasy. Yet it was a genuine practice. The sheer array of strange and often ineffective remedies meant that your recovery often depended more on your body's natural resilience than on the doctor's intervention. It's important to remember that while Rome had impressive public health infrastructure, like sewers and public baths, these were for sanitation and hygiene in a broad sense, not for individual medical care. They didn't prevent disease transmission in the way modern public health initiatives do. In fact, the communal nature of the baths, while promoting cleanliness, could also be a breeding ground for various ailments if not properly maintained. So, while you might appreciate the clean water flowing through the city, your individual medical woes were a different matter entirely. Historians still debate whether Roman medical practices, on balance, did more harm than good. While some physicians did demonstrate remarkable anatomical knowledge, particularly through the dissection of animals, human dissection was generally taboo. Their understanding of physiology and disease causation was fundamentally flawed. The lack of controlled experiments, the reliance on anecdotal evidence, and the strong influence of tradition meant that genuine medical progress was slow and often accidental. You, as the Roman patient, were essentially a guinea pig in a vast, unregulated experiment. As your fever rages, and the medicus prescribes another round of bloodletting or a particularly unpleasant concoction, you might yearn for a simpler time. Or perhaps a future where medicine actually helped. You might wonder if the gods are truly punishing you, or if this suffering is just the natural course of human existence. The stench of herbs, the groans of other patients, and the general air of desperation would only add to your misery. You'd likely find yourself praying to every deity you could think of, hoping that some divine intervention would save you from your illness, and perhaps from your doctor. You've endured the initial consultation, perhaps feeling a bit lighter from the bloodletting, though certainly not in a good way. Your head still throbs, and the fever hasn't broken. Now, your medicus embarks on the next stage of your Roman medical journey, the prescription. And let me tell you, this isn't a simple pill or a modern antibiotic. Oh no. Prepare yourself for remedies that blur the line between medicine and an inventory of a particularly grotesque curiosity shop. The fundamental belief in the four humors means that every ingredient, every concoction, is designed to either purge, balance, or fortify these essential fluids. And the methods for achieving this are: to put it mildly. Inventive. Imagine being handed a small, clay pot, the contents of which emit a truly revolting odor. Your physician might explain, with a straight face, that this is a specially prepared mixture of bat's blood and ground lizard scales, perhaps mixed with a dash of donkey's milk. The logic bats, being creatures of the night, might hold power over darkness and disease. Lizards, with their ability to regenerate, could, theoretically, transfer that vitality to you. And donkey's milk, well, that was just believed to be generally nutritious and pure. You're instructed to drink this concoction, perhaps twice a day, despite your stomach churning at the mere thought. The modern you is screaming about salmonella and parasites. But the Roman you has no choice but to trust the learned medicus. This exemplifies a key aspect of Roman medicine, the reliance on sympathetic magic, where properties of an ingredient, e.g., a lizard's regeneration, are believed to transfer to the patient. And it wasn't just bizarre animal products. The Roman pharmacopoeia was a treasure trove of the odd and the unappetizing. Remember the gladiator's blood for epilepsy? That's just one example of the lengths people would go to. You might also encounter remedies made from human urine, used as a disinfectant or even consumed internally for various ailments. Think about that for a moment, voluntarily drinking human waste in the hopes of feeling better. It speaks volumes about the desperation of patients and the limited options available. Your physician might also recommend a poultice of dog's feces for a wound, believing the warmth and natural properties, whatever those might be, would aid healing. The smell alone would be enough to make you reconsider your commitment to health. Beyond the ingredients, the method of administration was often equally unpleasant. Vomiting and purging were popular methods to expel bad humors. So, your medicus might prescribe hellebore, a highly toxic plant, as a powerful emetic. You'd be violently ill, emptying your stomach and bowels, and your doctor would proudly declare that the bad humors were leaving your body. Of course, the reality is, you're just severely dehydrated and probably closer to collapse. But in the Roman worldview, this was progress. Similarly, enemas were commonplace, often using potent and irritating substances to induce bowel movements. You were, quite literally, being cleansed from the inside out, often to your extreme discomfort. One particularly grim reality for you as a Roman patient involved surgery, if your illness required an incision, or a bone needed setting. You faced an ordeal of unimaginable pain. There was no effective anesthesia. You might be given a strong dose of opium or mandrake, but these would only dull the edges of agony, not eliminate it. Imagine a surgeon, perhaps with unwashed hands and instruments that had just been used on another patient, preparing to cut into your flesh. You would be held down by assistants, your screams echoing in the small room. A broken leg would be set without proper pain relief, the bones manipulated back into place with brute force. The shock alone could be enough to kill you, let alone the infection that was almost guaranteed to follow. This lack of understanding about antiseptics and germ theory was perhaps the biggest failing of Roman medicine. Surgeons. Despite their often impressive anatomical knowledge gained from dissecting animals, and occasionally, criminals, had no concept of microscopic organisms causing disease. A physician might wipe their instruments on a dirty rag between patients, or use a cloth to staunch bleeding that was already contaminated. Wounds, whether from injury or surgery, were routinely packed with materials that were far from sterile, creating perfect breeding grounds for bacteria. It was less about healing and more about managing to survive the inevitable infection. Many Roman medical instruments, while sometimes elegantly crafted, were essentially just sharpened pieces of bronze or iron, without any thought given to how they might carry disease. Think about the long-term consequences. A simple infection, easily treatable today with antibiotics, could become a raging fever, leading to gangrene, limb amputation, or death. Amputations were performed with terrifying speed, less to minimize pain, which was impossible, and more to reduce the overall time of the procedure before the patient bled out or succumbed to shock. The success rate was low, and even if you survived, you might be left permanently maimed or debilitated. The physical and emotional scars would last a lifetime, assuming you even had a lifetime left. You might wonder, with all these ineffective and often harmful practices, why did people still go to doctors? The truth is, they had no other options. The alternative was often to simply suffer, or to rely purely on prayer and folk remedies. The medicus, despite his shortcomings, represented the pinnacle of available medical knowledge, and occasionally, through sheer luck or a body's incredible resilience, a patient might recover. This would, of course, reinforce the doctor's beliefs in his own methods, however flawed. Historians still debate the extent to which Roman doctors consciously understood the concept of prognosis beyond simply guessing. While some records show physicians making predictions about a patient's outcome, it's unclear how much of this was based on actual clinical signs versus a general intuition or even a desire to manage expectations. You, as the patient, would be keenly aware that your fate was largely out of your doctor's hands, and often out of your own. And what about a mundane issue, like a toothache? You might visit a barber surgeon, a jack-of-all-trades who performed everything from shaves to minor surgical procedures. Imagine a crude pair of pliers, and the barber surgeon wrenching out your aching tooth without any numbing agent. The pain would be excruciating, and the risk of infection high. You might leave with one less tooth, but also with a new, potentially life-threatening problem. This was the reality of basic care. There were no dental schools, no specialized dentists as we know them. It was a brutal, painful, and often dangerous business. So, as you lay in your bed, recovering from your latest treatment, perhaps with a fresh set of leeches on your arm, or a strange-smelling poultice on your chest, you realize that being a Roman patient wasn't just about dealing with your illness, it was about enduring the cure, often a more traumatic experience than the ailment itself. You'd likely be less afraid of the disease and more afraid of what the doctor might do to you next. Having survived the initial rounds of bizarre remedies and the unsettling prospect of Roman surgery, you might now be contemplating your next meal. But hold on, because even your diet was part of the Roman medical regimen, and it could be just as unappetizing as the rest of the treatments. The concept of dietetics was very much a part of ancient medicine, deeply intertwined with the humoral theory. Your medicus believed that certain foods could influence the balance of your humors, and therefore could either heal or harm you. This meant a meal wasn't just about sustenance, it was a therapeutic intervention, often devoid of pleasure. Imagine being prescribed a diet so bland, so utterly uninspiring, that it makes modern hospital food seem gourmet. If your medicus determined you had too much hot humor, like blood or yellow bile, you might be put on a diet of cooling foods, plain barley gruel, watery broths, and perhaps some cooked lettuce. No spices, no rich meats, nothing that could possibly excite your humors further. Conversely, if you were deemed to have an excess of cold humors, like phlegm, you might be given warmer, drier foods, though still generally unappetizing. The emphasis was on simplicity and purity, rather than flavor or variety. You'd likely be constantly hungry, and the lack of enjoyable food would only add to your overall misery. Beyond just the type of food, the preparation was also critical. Overcooking was often preferred to ensure purity, and freshness was, of course, a luxury. You might find yourself chewing on tough, boiled vegetables, or sipping lukewarm, flavorless liquids, all in the name of balance. The pleasure of a rich Roman banquet, with its exotic spices and varied dishes, would be a distant, tantalizing memory. You were literally eating your medicine, and it tasted like it. But the difficulties weren't confined to your plate. Your living environment also played a significant role in your perceived recovery. Roman doctors understood that fresh air and cleanliness were important, but their understanding was often rudimentary. While the elite could afford villas with good ventilation, if you were a common citizen, you might be living in a cramped insula apartment building, where fresh air was scarce, and sanitation was questionable. Your medicus might advise you to seek out pure air, perhaps by moving to the countryside. But for most, this was an impossible luxury. You'd be stuck in the urban sprawl, breathing in the fumes of unwashed streets and crowded markets, hoping that the air wasn't contributing to your imbalance. The concept of hygiene, while present, was also different. While Romans famously had public baths, which were a cornerstone of their social life and personal cleanliness, these baths could also be vectors for disease. Imagine dipping into communal water that has been used by hundreds of people, some of whom might be carrying skin infections or other ailments. While the hot water and scrubbing might make you feel clean, the lack of chlorine or modern filtration meant you were potentially exposing yourself to more germs than you were washing away. So, while your medicus might prescribe regular bathing, you were still navigating a world where the very act of cleanliness could be a gamble. Then there's the issue of rest. Your medicus would undoubtedly prescribe rest, but what kind of rest in a society that valued activity and public life? True solitude and quiet might be hard to come by, especially if you lived in a noisy apartment. You might be told to avoid strenuous activity, but the realities of daily life often made such advice impractical. If you were a laborer, taking extended time off work due to illness meant economic hardship, further compounding your stress and potentially hindering your recovery. The medical advice, while well-intentioned, often clashed with the harsh realities of Roman life. One of the more frustrating aspects of being a Roman patient was the sheer variability in medical expertise. As we discussed, there was no standardized training. This meant that the quality of care you received could vary wildly depending on which medicus you consulted. You might encounter a charlatan who is more interested in your money than your health, prescribing elaborate but useless remedies. Or you might stumble upon a genuinely skilled practitioner, perhaps someone who had learned from a more experienced mentor, and who possessed a keen eye for observation. The problem was, you, the patient, had no way of knowing the difference. It was a true medical lottery. Historians still debate the true effectiveness of Roman medical practitioners. While some argue that many traditional remedies actually had some medicinal properties, e.g., willow bark containing salicylates, a precursor to aspirin, the dosage, preparation, and combination with other useless or harmful ingredients often rendered them ineffective or dangerous. The core issue wasn't necessarily the lack of any effective substances, but the absence of a scientific methodology to test and refine their use. You, the patient, were relying on centuries of inherited, often unverified, wisdom. You might also encounter various specialized practitioners, though their level of expertise could be equally questionable. There were oculary eye doctors, dentari, though often just barber surgeons as mentioned, and even specialists for specific conditions. But again, their knowledge was limited by the prevailing medical theories and the lack of modern understanding. A cataract might be cured by a crude surgical procedure that often resulted in blindness, rather than restored sight. A toothache, as we discussed, was met with extraction, often leading to more problems than it solved. The specialization often meant a deeper dive into flawed methodologies rather than a more effective treatment. Consider the psychological toll this must have taken. You're in pain, you're suffering, and the very people who are supposed to help you are subjecting you to unpleasant treatments, strange diets, and often, little relief. The constant uncertainty, the reliance on bizarre remedies, and the high risk of complications must have been incredibly stressful. You would live with a constant fear of illness, knowing that a simple ailment could easily spiral into a life-threatening ordeal, and that the cure might be as bad as the disease. The Romans did develop some genuinely impressive medical tools, especially for surgery. Many of the instruments found at sites like Pompeii are strikingly similar to those used by surgeons until relatively recently, before precision and sterile techniques became paramount. However, the sophistication of the tools often outstripped the understanding of their proper use. A finely crafted scalpel is only as good as the knowledge of the hand that wields it. and without an understanding of infection. Even the sharpest blade could be a conduit for death. So, as you slowly chew on your bland barley gruel, contemplating your doctor's advice to take a daily stroll in the pure air of the crowded city, you realize that being a Roman patient was a test of endurance, both physical and mental. You were navigating a medical landscape filled with well-intentioned but often misguided practitioners, relying on theories that bordered on the fantastical, and hoping, perhaps against all odds, that your body would simply heal itself despite their interventions. You've survived the questionable diets and the chilling thought of Roman surgery without anesthetic. Now, let's talk about the recovery, or rather, the lack thereof. Because even if you somehow made it through the doctor's treatments and your body managed to fight off the illness, the aftercare in ancient Rome was often a hit-or-miss affair, frequently leaving you vulnerable to relapse or new complications. There was no concept of sterile dressings, no antibiotics to prevent secondary infections, and certainly no physical therapy to regain strength. You were largely on your own, relying on your body's natural resilience and perhaps a bit of luck. Imagine, for instance, you've just endured a nasty fever. Your medicus, proud of his often accidental success, might declare you cured, but your body is weak, your immune system compromised. You're sent home, likely to a living situation that's far from ideal for a recovering patient. Your wound, if you had one, might be dressed with rags that were merely washed, not sterilized. The concept of asepsis, preventing contamination by microorganisms, was completely unknown. So, even if the initial procedure went well, the risk of a secondary infection setting in was incredibly high. A small cut could turn into a festering sore, leading to sepsis, a systemic infection that often proved fatal. The Roman understanding of convalescence was rudimentary. While they recognized the need for rest, they didn't grasp the intricacies of rehabilitation. If you had a broken limb, once the bones were crudely set, you'd be left to recover strength and mobility on your own. There were no physical therapists to guide you, no exercises to help you regain muscle mass. You might emerge from your illness with a limp, a weakened arm, or chronic pain, simply because the body wasn't given the proper support to heal completely. The lasting effects of even a successful recovery could significantly impact your quality of life. Consider the social implications of being ill in Rome. If you were a slave, your recovery might be crucial to your value, and your master might invest more in your care, sometimes with surprising results given the limited medical knowledge. However, if you were a poor free citizen, a prolonged illness could mean financial ruin. There was no social safety net, no disability benefits. If you couldn't work, you couldn't eat. This economic pressure would often force people to return to their labors too soon, exacerbating their condition and setting them up for relapse. You couldn't afford the luxury of a slow, proper recovery. One common historical truth is that doctors were often viewed with suspicion in Roman society, precisely because their treatments were so often ineffective or harmful. While some Medici gained reputations for skill, many were seen as opportunistic quacks. There was no clear distinction between a legitimate physician and someone peddling snake oil. This skepticism was well-founded, as your own experiences would attest. You might find yourself questioning every piece of advice, every concoction, wondering if it would truly help or just inflict more suffering. Historians still debate the extent to which placebo effects played a role in Roman medicine. Given the strong belief in supernatural forces, the power of ritual, and the sheer desperation of patients, it's plausible that some individuals experienced improvement simply because they believed the treatment would work, even if the active ingredients were inert or harmful. You might have seen others swear by a particular amulet or a specific herbal remedy, fueling your own hope, however faint, that it might work for you too. This human tendency to find meaning and hope even in the face of despair was likely a significant factor in patient compliance. The Romans also had a fascination with materia medica, the substances used in medicine. Their trade routes brought in exotic ingredients from far-flung lands, some with genuine medicinal properties, others entirely useless. You might be prescribed something rare and expensive, imported from Egypt or India, simply because its foreign origin imbued it with a sense of potency. The perceived value of an ingredient often outweighed its actual efficacy. This meant you could be spending your meager savings on a remedy that was, at best, inert, and at worst, toxic. The public health measures in Rome, while impressive for their time, often had a paradoxical effect. The famous Roman baths, as mentioned, were a double-edged sword. While promoting cleanliness, they also facilitated the spread of certain diseases. Similarly, the dense urban populations, though served by aqueducts and sewers, still lived in close proximity, making the rapid transmission of epidemics almost inevitable. When a plague struck, your medicus would be largely helpless, offering only the same ineffective remedies that failed to stem the tide of disease. You'd witness firsthand the sheer terror and helplessness as illness swept through your community, often with little to no resistance from the medical establishment. Consider the role of religious healing. When all else failed, many Romans turned to the gods. Temples dedicated to healing deities like Asclepius became centers of pilgrimage. You might have seen people spending nights in these temples, hoping for divine dreams that would reveal a cure, or experiencing spontaneous healing attributed to the gods' intervention. While these were often psychological phenomena, or the natural course of recovery, they offered a solace and a hope that the earthly medicus often couldn't provide. You might have found yourself in desperation, making offerings or performing rituals, seeking a higher power to succeed where human knowledge failed. And what about the concept of pain itself? In an era without effective pain relief, pain was simply a part of life. It was to be endured, not necessarily eliminated. Your medicus wouldn't spend much time trying to make you comfortable. Their focus was on balancing humors or purging ailments. This stoic acceptance of suffering, while perhaps necessary for survival, must have been incredibly taxing. You would live with chronic aches, the lingering pain of an injury, or the ongoing discomfort of a chronic condition, with little expectation of relief. So, as you slowly regain your strength, perhaps with a persistent cough or a limp that never quite goes away, you reflect on your medical journey. You survived. Yes, but not without considerable suffering, expense, and a healthy dose of luck. The Roman medical system, for all its grand pronouncements and exotic ingredients, was a brutal lottery where the odds were often stacked against you. You emerge from the experience not cured in the modern sense, but simply alive, perhaps a little wiser, and certainly more wary of anyone offering to balance your humors. You've endured the horrors of conventional medicine and perhaps gained a glimpse into the harsh realities of military medicine. Now, let's consider another aspect, one that, while seemingly more organized, was still fraught with immense suffering: the role of military medicine in ancient Rome. While the battlefield might seem a place of chaos and death, within the Roman army, you'd find a more structured medical system, albeit one still deeply flawed. However, make no mistake, it remained a painful and often fatal experience. Imagine you are a Roman soldier, on the front lines, a sword wound, an arrow embedded in your flesh, or a blunt force trauma is an almost inevitable part of your existence. Unlike civilians, Roman soldiers were slightly more fortunate in that they had the support of a dedicated military medical system. The Roman army was one of the first forces in history to establish an official medical service, complete with military doctors, medici militares, and field hospitals, valetudinaria, located at permanent camps. This meant that, if wounded, you were more likely to receive immediate attention than a regular citizen in the city. However, attention here meant something entirely different. Imagine yourself lying on a crude cot in a valetudinarium, a simple structure, often a series of rooms or tents. While seemingly more organized, the sanitary conditions were still primitive. Surgical instruments, no matter how elegantly crafted, remained unsterilized. The military doctor, perhaps a former soldier with some rudimentary training, or someone with a smattering of medical knowledge would approach you. One lesser-known historical fact is that while the Roman army had a relatively advanced medical system, their primary focus was not on prolonging life at all costs, but on returning the soldier to combat as quickly as possible. This meant that treatments often focused on stabilizing the initial wound, with less regard for long-term complications. If you had a deep cut, the doctor would attempt to stitch it up crudely, completely unaware of the risk of infection. While amputations were performed somewhat routinely on the battlefield to save soldiers from gangrene, they were horrifying spectacles, conducted without effective anesthesia. The screams of your comrades undergoing surgery would haunt you. Historians still debate whether the mortality rates in Roman military medicine were significantly lower than for civilians, or if it was simply a matter of better record-keeping. However, it's clear that military doctors gained more experience in dealing with specific types of combat injuries, such as broken bones, stab wounds, and head trauma. They learned from practical experience and accumulated knowledge from thousands of similar cases. Nevertheless, the lack of understanding about germs meant that no matter how experienced they were still fighting in the dark against an invisible enemy infection. You might be given herbal pain relievers like opium, but their effects would only dull the edges of agonizing pain. Hot water and wine were often used to clean wounds, but they were insufficient to kill bacteria. The only thing truly preventing infection from spreading was your own immune system. If you were healthy enough and lucky, your body would win this fight on its own. Furthermore, beyond combat wounds, Roman soldiers also faced common diseases like malaria, dysentery, and other epidemics that spread rapidly in crowded barracks. While there were sanitary measures like fresh water and relatively good drainage systems in larger camps, the close quarters and lack of germ theory understanding made these ailments a constant threat. An outbreak could decimate an entire legion faster than any enemy. When you think about recovery, imagine trying to walk again with a wounded leg, or attempting to use a broken arm with no guidance from a specialist. Full rehabilitation was a luxury. The goal was for you to be able to wield a sword again, even if with limited capacity. Many Roman veterans who survived battles often carried permanent scars and chronic pain, a testament to the brutality of both warfare and the medicine of the era. It's somewhat surprising that while Roman military medicine was quite organized, the healthcare for civilians was much more ad hoc and unregulated. Perhaps this reflects the value Roman society placed on its military, those who preserved peace and expanded the empire. You might find yourself wishing you were a soldier if you were a civilian with a serious illness, simply for the higher chance of being attended to by a professional doctor. In summary, Roman military medicine, while a significant step up from nothing, was still a painful and perilous experience. It offers a stark insight into the limitations of medical knowledge in the ancient world and the sheer fortitude or desperation you would need to survive. You've survived the questionable diets and the chilling thought of Roman surgery without anesthetic. Now, let's talk about one of the most truly terrifying aspects of Roman medicine: the surgical procedures and medical interventions that, without anesthesia and antiseptics, would make you wish you had never stepped foot into a physician's office. This is where the line between healing and torture blurred in a truly horrifying way. Imagine you have an internal growth, or a wound that needs deep debridement. You would be taken to a medicus with some surgical experience, in a simple room, perhaps even his own living quarters. There was no concept of sterility. Instruments, as we've discussed, were minimally cleaned or simply wiped down with a dirty cloth. Dim light from a small window or an oil lamp would cast shadows on the scene. You'd be asked to lie down, and immediately, you'd feel a chilling dread as you caught sight of crude knives, forceps, and hooks. There was no anesthesia as we know it. At best, you might be given a dose of opium or mandrake. Opium might make you drowsy, but it couldn't fully eliminate the sensation of pain. Mandrake was a stronger anesthetic, but its dosage was incredibly difficult to control and often led to hallucinations or even death. Imagine your body still registering every cut, every clamp, while your mind drifted in a nightmare. You would be restrained or held down by strong assistants, your screams echoing in the small room. One often overlooked historical truth is that despite Rome's magnificent engineering and impressive infrastructure, they lacked any significant advancements in understanding germs and infection. This was the fatal flaw. Any incision, no matter how small, opened the door for bacteria to enter. Doctors often used wine or vinegar to clean wounds, sometimes heating their knives to sterilize them, unaware that the temperature wasn't sufficient to kill all pathogens. After surgery, wounds were dressed with linen, perhaps washed but not sterilized, or worse, with untreated wool, creating an ideal breeding ground for bacteria. Think about a common surgical procedure: amputation. If you suffered from gangrene due to an untreated wound or severe infection, limb removal was often the only option to save your life. This technique was known to the Romans, and they performed it with terrifying speed, not to minimize your pain, which was impossible, but to complete the procedure as quickly as possible before you died from shock or blood loss. The surgeon would use saws, sharp knives, and forceps to cut through skin, muscle, and bone. You would scream in unimaginable agony as blood flowed freely. After the limb was removed, the wound would be bandaged and cauterized using hot irons to seal the blood vessels, but the risk of post-operative infection remained extremely high. Many who survived the amputation would still succumb to infection days later. Historians still debate whether the Roman physicians' understanding of anatomy was truly sufficient to perform complex surgeries, while Galen, one of the greatest Roman physicians, performed dissections on animals and had significant anatomical knowledge. The application of that knowledge to human bodies was limited due to the prohibition of human cadaver dissection. This meant that many surgeons still relied on practical experience, often gained on the battlefield where they could practice on open wounds. You would have been putting your life in the hands of someone who might understand bones and muscles intimately, but was completely blind to what was happening inside your body at a cellular level. Even simple procedures were a nightmare. If you suffered from bladder stones, an incredibly painful condition, the doctor might propose a lithotomy, a terrifying procedure where instruments were inserted through the urethra to crush the stone. Or worse, an incision was made directly into the bladder to remove it. The mortality rate from infection and complications was extremely high. You would endure unimaginable pain, followed by the risk of sepsis, a tragic outcome. Head injuries also posed a significant challenge. If you suffered a severe blow to the head, the doctor might perform a trepanation, drilling a hole into the skull to relieve pressure on the brain. While some people survived this procedure, it was incredibly risky and often led to brain infection and death. You would have witnessed the courage or desperation of those willing to take such extreme risks for a faint chance of survival. What's more, there was a complete lack of post-operative care. After a surgery, you wouldn't receive any proper medical follow-up, no antibiotics, no intensive physical therapy. You would be sent home with an open wound and some vague instructions from the doctor. You would be left to face the pain, weakness, and imminent risk of infection on your own. As you lay there, trying to recover from a painful and dangerous procedure, you would gain a profound understanding of why being a Roman patient truly sucked. It wasn't just the lack of understanding of disease, but the brutality of the treatments, the absence of hygiene, and the fact that you were left to fend for yourself in a life-or-death struggle with your own body. Every scream, every drop of blood spilled on the cold stone floor was a testament to an era of medicine where survival was a miracle, not an expected outcome. You've experienced the brutal treatments and the frightening lack of basic hygiene. Now let's turn to another aspect. Perhaps even more perplexing in Roman medicine, the intertwining of medicine and superstition. In a world where science was still in its infancy, gods, omens, and charms often played as significant a role as any herb or knife in the medicus office. Imagine you are gravely ill, perhaps with a chronic condition that your medicus has deemed untreatable. In desperation, you would lose faith in earthly methods. Instead, you would turn to the healing temples, most notably those dedicated to Asclepius in Roman, the god of medicine. These were not just places of prayer, but centers of healing in their own unique way. You would journey to the temple, bring offerings, and pray. One lesser-known historical fact is that these temples often housed non-venomous snakes within their precincts, symbols of Asclepius. You would see these snakes slithering freely, and their coiling around you was considered a good omen, a sign of divine healing. Imagine yourself lying on a mat in a sacred dormitory called an abaton, a place for incubation sleep. You would hope for a prophetic dream, where Asclepius or one of his emissaries would appear and reveal your cure. It might be a specific herb, a particular ritual, or sometimes just a reassuring word. Historians still debate whether most of the healings at these temples were due to the placebo effect and the power of belief, or if some genuinely improved due to basic hygiene practices and dietary recommendations within the temple complex. Nevertheless, it's clear that this spiritual experience offered immense hope and solace to desperate patients. For you, when all else failed, this was the last glimmer of light. Beyond the official deities, Romans also strongly believed in amulets and magical objects to ward off illness. You might be advised to wear a necklace with the image of a specific deity, or a small pouch containing herbs, precious stones, or even animal bones, all believed to possess protective or healing powers. The belief in the power of these items was so strong that they were often used as a preventative measure or as a supplementary treatment alongside conventional medicines. This illustrates the complex blend of rationality and superstition in Roman medical thinking. It wasn't just common beliefs. You might also encounter quacks or traveling charlatans who possess no medical knowledge whatsoever but were adept at exploiting patients' fears and desperation. They would sell you miracle cures made from bizarre ingredients, promising to cure all ailments. This only made it harder to discern a trustworthy medicus from a fraud. You would have to navigate a chaotic medical marketplace where convincingly presented falsehoods could be more dangerous than the original illness itself. An interesting aspect was the role of rituals and incantations in healing. Besides prayer, you might be advised to perform complex rituals, such as dedicating a clay or wax anatomical votive offering at a temple as a plea for the recovery of that specific body part. Or you might be instructed to perform symbolic actions, like spitting 3 times to ward off evil spirits, or walking backward to reverse the course of an illness. These actions, while lacking scientific basis, held deep spiritual significance and helped patients feel a sense of control over their fate. You would find that the boundaries between medicine and religion, between science and superstition, were incredibly blurred. For many Romans, an illness was not merely a physical ailment but a spiritual one, or even a divine punishment. Therefore, healing required not only the intervention of a physician, but also the appeasement of the soul and the approval of supernatural forces. This meant that, even if you had a skilled medicus, you would still feel the need to seek solace from the gods to ensure a favorable outcome. The reality was that despite their technical and architectural achievements, the Romans had not yet developed a robust scientific framework for understanding disease. This made them susceptible to supernatural explanations and unproven treatments. You, as the patient, would be caught in this interplay, facing physical suffering on one hand and battling fears of unseen forces on the other. This made your experience of illness far more complex and challenging. You've traversed the painful landscape of Roman medicine, from bizarre treatments to fundamental sanitary failings, and even the spiritual aspects. Now, let's look at yet another facet that made your experience truly awful: the profound absence of basic hygiene and infection control as we understand it today. This was a world where a minor cut could become a death sentence, not because of the cut itself, but because of what you couldn't see. Imagine you have an open wound, perhaps from a work accident or a clumsy cut. You go to the medicus, who examines your injury. There are no rubber gloves, no antiseptic solutions. The doctor might touch your wound with bare hands, hands that might have just touched another patient. Or worse, just come from a privy without being properly washed. The concept of microorganisms and how they cause disease was completely unknown to the Romans. They believed illness was caused by humoral imbalances, bad air miasma, or divine punishment, not by tiny invisible creatures. A common example is the reuse of surgical instruments. Instruments made of bronze or iron, though often exquisitely crafted, would be used repeatedly on multiple patients. After each use, they might be cursorily rinsed in cold water, or perhaps just wiped on a dirty cloth. There was no concept of boiling, autoclaving, or using chemical disinfectants to sterilize. So, every time an instrument was reused, it carried pathogens from the previous patient to the next. You would feel a chill down your spine imagining the same blade that just cut someone else was now about to touch you. This explains why post-operative infection was the leading cause of death after surgery. Even a technically successful operation, like the removal of a growth or setting a broken bone, was highly likely to result in systemic infection. The wound would swell, fester with pus, and you would develop a raging fever. Your doctor would explain this as laudable pus or the ingress of bad humors, and might even try to drain it further, only making the situation worse. Historians still debate whether some Roman practices might have inadvertently offered sanitary benefits. For instance, the use of wine or vinegar to clean wounds might have had mild antiseptic properties. The construction of massive sewers and aqueducts was an incredible feat of public sanitation. However, these measures were not based on an understanding of germs, but primarily on removing foul smells and waste, which were believed to cause disease. You would benefit from clean water and relatively clean streets, but that wouldn't protect you from pathogens on the doctor's hands. Think about epidemics. When a disease swept through the community, whether it was smallpox, plague, or influenza, the Romans were largely helpless. There were no vaccines, no antibiotics, and no effective science-based quarantine measures. Doctors could only try their usual ineffective remedies. You would witness loved ones fall ill and die at alarming rates, while the Medici stood by, largely powerless, offering futile advice and ineffective measures. The lack of understanding about contagion made epidemics an almost unstoppable force of devastation. Even seemingly simple personal hygiene practices carried risks. The communal baths were a vital part of Roman culture. While they promoted personal cleanliness, the fact that hundreds of people shared the same bathwater, which was not changed or filtered frequently, could turn the baths into breeding grounds for disease. You might emerge from the baths feeling clean, only to have contracted a contagious ailment from someone else. It's ironic that the Romans achieved such extraordinary technical feats in so many areas, yet they couldn't cross the microbiological barrier. They could build structures that lasted millennia, but couldn't understand why a tiny scratch could kill a person. You would live in a world where architectural sophistication and medical primitivism existed side by side, creating a stark and often deadly contrast. As you leave your medicus's office, whether with a bandaged wound or a dreadful potion to swallow, you would carry with you not just the pain of your ailment, but also the lurking danger of infection. You would understand that in the Roman world, surviving an illness was not just about overcoming the disease itself, but also about escaping the invisible perils inadvertently introduced by those trying to help you. You've traversed through the brutal treatments, the shocking lack of hygiene, and the spiritual elements of Roman medicine. Now, let's delve into one of the most fundamental reasons why being a Roman patient would have truly sucked: the utter absence of effective anesthesia and pain relief. In a world without synthetic opioids or modern anesthetics, pain was not just a symptom. It was an unavoidable companion to every illness and every surgical procedure. Imagine you have a complex bone fracture, or you need a growth removed. You would be placed on a hard wooden table, and there would be no drug that could effectively numb your senses. At best, you might be given a dose of opium, derived from the poppy plant. Opium would induce drowsiness and dull the edge of the pain, but it could not eliminate sensation entirely. You would still feel the knife cutting through your flesh, the forceps clamping onto bone, but in a hazy, dreamlike state. A waking nightmare. Another substance often used was mandrake. The roots of the mandrake plant contain alkaloids that can induce powerful anesthetic and sedative effects. However, using mandrake was incredibly dangerous. The dosage was notoriously difficult to control. Too little might not be enough to induce anesthesia, but too much could easily be fatal due to poisoning or respiratory arrest. You would be betting your life on the physician's ability to guess the correct dosage, hoping he didn't give you too little so you'd feel everything, or too much so you'd never wake up. Historians still debate whether Roman doctors fully understood the connection between their anesthetic attempts and mortality rates, or if they simply accepted the risks as part of the gamble. However, It's clear that the use of these substances was often a trade-off between agonizing pain and the very real risk of death. You, as the patient, would be faced with a terrifying choice: endure unimaginable pain while conscious, or risk your life with a drug that might kill you. Even for chronic pain conditions, such as persistent headaches, joint aches, or lingering pain from old injuries, the options for relief were incredibly limited. You might be prescribed herbal teas or spiced wines, but these would offer only mild solace, not true comfort. You would simply have to learn to live with the pain, accepting it as an inescapable part of life. This is a stark contrast to the modern world, where we have a vast array of pain medications from mild to strong. When you think of a simple procedure like a tooth extraction, there was no local or general anesthetic. The dentist, or more accurately, a barber surgeon or general practitioner, would use crude pliers to wrench your offending tooth out. You would feel every crack as it pulled away from your gum, every warm gush of blood. It would be a horrifying experience, often leading to shock or fainting from the sheer agony. The absence of effective pain relief also meant that surgical procedures were often performed with incredible speed. Rapidity was key to minimize the time the patient had to endure the pain and the risk of shock. Roman surgeons, while perhaps lacking in anesthetic knowledge, were often highly skilled at performing quick, sometimes brutal, procedures. You would find yourself cut, prodded, and stitched with haste, not for precision, but for the sheer necessity of ending your suffering as quickly as possible. The lack of understanding about infection control further compounded the problem of absent anesthesia. Even if you managed to endure the pain of surgery, the risk of post-operative infection was incredibly high. If antibiotics existed, one might tolerate more pain knowing the chances of survival were higher. But without either, you were facing a double abyss of both agony and death. As you lay there, listening to the screams echoing from a nearby room where another patient was undergoing a procedure, you would feel a profound sense of empathy. You would know exactly what that pain felt like. And you would know that there was nothing that could truly soothe it. The fear would not just be of death, but of the agonizing process of reaching that death, a path paved with unbearable suffering. This highlights one of the greatest differences between ancient and modern medicine. Today, the goal is not only to cure the ailment, but also to make the healing process as comfortable as possible. In Roman times, you could only hope to survive, while comfort was a luxury that simply didn't exist. You've endured all the suffering a Roman patient could possibly bear: the flawed medical theories, the grotesque concoctions, the terrifying surgeries without anesthesia, and the ever-present danger of infection. Now, let's conclude this journey by looking at the legacy of Roman medicine and the slow dawn of a more scientific approach, a transition that you, as a sick person of that era, would never have lived to see. Think about what you have just experienced. You were treated by doctors who often lacked fundamental knowledge of human anatomy due to the taboo against dissecting human cadavers. They relied on theories like the four humors, which had existed for centuries and were almost impossible to challenge. Every remedy, every surgical procedure, was a gamble, where luck played a far greater role than medical knowledge. This left you, the patient, in a constant state of anxiety, never knowing whether the next cure would heal you or simply make things worse. One often overlooked historical truth is that while the Romans excelled at engineering and military organization, they were not great medical theorists. Much of what they knew about medicine was inherited from the Greeks, particularly the works of Hippocrates and later Galen. Galen was a brilliant physician who documented his observations in detail, primarily from dissecting animals and treating gladiators. He made significant contributions to anatomy and physiology, and his works dominated European medicine for over a millennium. However, even Galen made many mistakes due to the lack of human dissection, and his errors were blindly copied and propagated for generations. You would have found yourself subject to theories that were partially correct but also riddled with inaccuracies, widely accepted without any real empirical verification. Historians still debate whether the slow pace of medical advancement was due to the over-veneration of ancient authors like Galen. While his knowledge was vast, the fact that subsequent generations merely copied and accepted his words as gospel, rather than experimenting and challenging them, stifled progress. If you had lived during that period, you would have been a victim of a medical system overly reliant on tradition and authority, rather than innovation. Following the collapse of the Roman Empire, much of this medical knowledge was lost or fragmented. However, Galen's works were preserved and studied in the Islamic world, where medicine continued to evolve with some significant improvements. But it wasn't until the European Middle Ages and Renaissance when human dissection became more acceptable and the scientific method began to take shape, that medicine truly started to emerge from the shadow of ancient Rome and Greece. You would undoubtedly feel a sense of relief knowing that the horrific treatments you endured were eventually superseded. Ideas about personal hygiene, infection control, though still without an understanding of germs, and pain relief began to be explored. But this process was incredibly slow, taking hundreds of years for true breakthroughs like the discovery of microorganisms, the development of effective anesthesia, and the invention of antibiotics. You lived and suffered through an era where the most basic tenets of modern medicine were still distant dreams. The end of Roman medicine wasn't an abrupt event, but a gradual decline and transformation. It left behind a mixed legacy on one hand, impressive achievements in public sanitation and sophisticated surgical instruments. On the other, flawed medical theories and agonizing treatments. You, the Roman patient, experienced those shortcomings firsthand. However, it was precisely the challenges and failures of Roman medicine that laid the groundwork for future discoveries. The unanswered questions, the mysteries of the human body, ultimately propelled future scientists and doctors to seek better answers. While you wouldn't have benefited from those advancements, your painful experience is part of the larger story of medicine's evolution.